As you can see, I finally got the engine started. It didn't go quite as smoothly as might be indicated by the video. I had no oil pressure, I had no fuel pressure, I had no spark, and when I put gas in the tank it started to leak. I'm going to walk you through each of the things I did in order to get the car started for the first time, and maybe that'll give you some ideas of problems to avoid when you have the same situation. When I put some gas in the tank, it immediately started leaking. I got underneath and discovered the drain plug just needed to be tightened up a quarter turn or so. I then removed the spark plugs to turn the engine over with the starter motor just to see if I was getting oil pressure and to see if I was getting fuel pressure and to check the spark. As it turns out, none of those things were working. I turned the car over with the starter motor and there was no pressure showing on the gauge. So I disconnected the oil pressure gauge from the tube coming from the engine up at the firewall. I turned it over again to see if any oil was coming out of that tube, and there was nothing. So I knew I had rebuilt the oil pump and not primed the pump by putting oil in the chamber when I had finished. So I dropped the oil pump away from the block. I used a funnel to fill it with some oil and then tightened it back up again. The next time I turned the car over with the starter motor, I immediately started getting oil coming out through the oil instrument gauge tube. So I knew I had oil pressure at that point and connected that part back up again. Now that I had oil pressure, I went around to turn the motor over again to see if I was getting any fuel pressure, because I still had not gotten any fuel in the sediment bowl on the fuel pump. Turning it over even more did not solve that problem, so I decided to take the fuel pump off just to check to make sure what the problem was there. I had rebuilt the pump a couple of years ago with a new kit, even though it was an NOS pump. I wanted to make sure all the rubber parts were fresh in there. And in taking it apart, I discovered that one of the valves was stuck open. So I just blew a little air gently through it, and that popped the valve back down, and then it was able to work. I put it back together again, put it back on the car, and immediately started getting fuel being drawn from the tank. But when the fuel sediment bowl got full, I started getting a leak squirting out from around one of the screws. So I took the pump off again, took it apart again, and discovered that when I had put the diaphragm in, the rubber pump part in the middle, I had it stretched a little bit and it had pulled away from around one of the screw holes, so the gas was able to leak up past the screw. So I put it together this time, making sure there was no tension on the diaphragm, and tightened it down. And then finally I had the issue of spark. There was no spark. I called my friend Steve.
Hi Mark, good morning.
Who had rebuilt the starter and the generator and the distributor for me, and asked him what I should try. He suggested taking a piece of manila cardboard, like file folder, and just rubbing it between the points on the distributor and see if that might clear off any corrosion that had built up during the time the car was in storage. So I did that, just took a couple of swipes with the cardboard, and immediately I started getting spark. At that point I was able to start the car. I went around to check all of the fittings and to see if anything was leaking and make sure everything was charging properly. First thing I noticed was I had oil leaking out through the oil filter. And once again, the problem, similar to the gas tank, was I just needed to tighten the cap down a little bit. The oil pressure is running a little high. It should be running about 15 pounds at idle, and it was running up to about 30-35 pounds. So I may need to replace the spring, but I want to get the car up to speed first just to see what kind of pressure I'm getting. In checking the ammeter, I wasn't getting any charge. In fact, I was getting a slight discharge, which would indicate that the generator wasn't charging. So once again, I called my friend Steve, and he suggested taking the regulator and grounding the field terminal. So by connecting a jumper from the field terminal on the regulator to ground, I was able to show the generator was charging. So that indicated there was a problem with the field coil in the regulator. I took the cover off of the regulator and checked the points once again by rubbing a piece of manila cardboard between them to see whether or not there was any kind of corrosion on those. I put it back onto the car, and once again there was no charge from the generator. I called Steve again, and he said needed to be bench tested, probably had to adjust the gap and also adjust the spring tension on the points so that they would open and close at the right time. So that was my next step. I took the battery, the generator, and the regulator all out to his place where he could hook them up to a bench test machine and he could see exactly what the problem was.
You have to adjust it by pushing it down. By putting more spring pinch, this little spring, you have to put more spring pinch on it. Now it's putting on 15 ounces.
I brought the regulator home, put it back on the car, everything started up, the generator's charging, I'm getting the right charge showing on the ammeter, on the instrument panel, and it looks like things are ready to go. As I move into the home stretch here, several projects are coming to a conclusion. I got the last of the chrome plating back this week. Also, we're making good progress on completing the interior. I had the seat frames and springs home this week, and I had a little help getting those cleaned up. I also trial fit the front seat in the body and adjusted the seat adjustment mechanism to make sure that it worked properly. And finally, we installed the rear fenders along with a stainless steel bead, and I think they turned out really nice. In older cars that are bolted together, quite often a piece of anti-squeak material webbing was put between the two pieces of metal when they were bolted together. That way, when the car was going down the road and twisting, you wouldn't hear the metal rubbing together. That material was quite often very thin, about 20 thousandths. And most of the anti-squeak webbing that's available today is much thicker than that, about 60 thousandths. Now sometimes this is just too thick to fit in the place where you're trying to work it. Well, somebody at one of the classic car restoration businesses in town suggested that you use hockey stick tape. It's about 10 thousandths thick, so a couple layers of this equals what was used originally, and it works really well. It also has the advantage that it's adhesive on one side, so you can put it on and it stays while you're bolting the car together. Well, that's all the time we have for this week, so until we meet again, I'll see you on the road.